So our last video was about the difference between orthogonal and parallel gameplay. Orthogonal being at its most extreme, every choice that you make affects your opponent somehow, and parallel on the opposite end of that spectrum is that none of your choices affect your opponent. One of the things that I brought up in the video was that there's a growing number of players that seem to be preferring parallel play to orthogonal play. Sometimes this is seen as competitive versus casual, because I think parallel play tends to be a bit more casual, but it's not always necessarily the case. So we want to just take a little bit and discuss why players might be choosing to play in a more parallel way versus a more orthogonal way.
Distraction makers.
So over the last 10, 20 years, maybe, we've kind of been seeing this trend affecting the games industry as a whole. We can point to examples of the difference between something like 1v1 Magic being a much clearer orthogonal game versus Commander being much closer to parallel play. Although there's still lots of orthogonal instances within Commander. But if we were to look at other game genres, we could kind of point towards the evolution of something like a real-time strategy game like Age of Empires going into a MOBA like League of Legends, going into an auto battler like The Bazaar or something. And how a lot of not only the audience that's interested in these games has gone and trickled down from RTS into MOBA into auto battler, but also it sort of has gotten to this like refined point where it's taking all the very similar game actions and things that interest people that were interested in those games, but moving it away from this orthogonal play pattern and more into parallel play, where an auto battler, in most cases, like if we pointed to something like The Bazaar, your game actions don't have any effect on other players' game actions in comparison to other auto battlers where you're like playing with a persistent draft pool or something like that.
We've also seen this trend happen with the first-person shooter genre, where we've gone from something like Counter-Strike, like a tactical shooter, to something like Fortnite being a battle royale, and then finally now into sort of extraction shooters, which when we go from Counter-Strike to Fortnite, we're adding in a survival element, right? There is a ring that is forcing players to eventually interact with each other, but up until that point, it's like could be skirmishes. Scrimmage or skirmish.
Skirmish and scrimmage. Skirmishes.
You might encounter other players, but it's kind of a random occurrence, right? It's not forced by the system until the ring starts closing in, right? And so you might have an experience that's parallel where you're just running around collecting items while other players are running around collecting items that eventually leads to the conflict at the end where the ring has closed in around you. But when we go to an extraction shooter, we now have taken that idea of that sort of looting, right? Running around and picking stuff up and then bringing those items back to base. So you might like be out there and not really encounter anybody, right? Like there's nothing necessarily forcing that interaction except maybe, I'm assuming, the places where the items spawn are similar, so that might drive some amount of interaction within the gameplay.
Yeah, they've sort of opted to design points in level design that are going to force players to interact, but like you never have to. Now the goal of the game has shifted in extraction shooters, where the goal is how can I go and extract as much things, ideally, optimally without dying, but sometimes without interacting with as many players as I can.
Well, how are you going to die, right? Other players are going to kill you.
And so, but even an auto battler, right, if we watch that, has still sort of opted to, like, most of the time you're going to go and kill a person, you're going to defeat a person, but it's sort of a mirage of a person because that person, their actions didn't affect you. But when you're in a skirmish and extraction shooters, like that, their actions will decide your actions and vice versa. But yeah, like systems wise, you never have to go and interact with these people most of the time.
Okay, well, let's start getting into what we think are some of the forces, the pressures that are being applied to design that has potentially moved the player sensibilities towards parallel play. And some of this, I think, is driven by the player side of things, and some of this is driven by the designer side of things. So we're going to start off talking about market shifts that have moved game design towards parallel play. And the first one is that there is a modern day market pressure on games because there are so many games that it's likely that a player might play your game only once. And because of this, you want to design your game in a way that makes the best first impression. And oftentimes that has an effect where you are trying to control a lot of the elements about the game and the way that a player will experience it, because you want to make them consistent and consistently good. And when you add in an opponent that is highly interactive, the possibility that a player has a bad time becomes more likely.
There's more things that you have to sort of account for when other players are involved, or other players have more agency over the outcome of another player's experience. Where if you're designing for more of a parallel play, those interaction points, the things that a player is going to interact with the most, are a planned experience, meaning that you have greater control over optimally like how that's going to play out. And I think that you need to make sure that you have those high highs. And you see this like meticulously planned in like the AAA space to make sure like if someone is playing after the minute mark or 2 minute mark or 3 minute mark, you know, whatever those points are, like they're hitting this note and this note and this note, because we need to hook the player and get them invested right away.
And when it's taken to like its most extreme, we might have, game companies measuring, right, these results. Okay, how long do players stick around in our game? How do we make sure we're hooking them long enough that they feel like they got a fulfilling experience, but they may or may not come back. So we're going to focus on the first, hour of the game, the first 2 hours of the game, make that the best it can possibly be. But it's not a game that's built to be infinitely replayable.
Right. I think the biggest example of this is something like the fighting game genre, which there's lots and lots of fighting games that get made still, but it feels like every fighting game that gets made kind of has this same issue where like it's kind of the new kid on the block and everyone loves it and it's like amazing, and then it falls off very suddenly and quickly. We saw this most recently with like 2XKO suddenly like going under a Riot. And it feels like the reason why is because you can have this sort of flashy starting experience. And I think old fighting games maybe were a little bit better with this because I think they really emphasize the story mode a lot better. Smash Bros. Probably being one of the best examples that like it almost seemed like the game was meant more so for the story mode and that the PvP aspect was more like an optional thing. But I think with the rise of esports and seeing the popularity of that, there's been a lot more emphasis put on that sort of competitive thing. So now you take something like the fighting game genre, which is so inherently systems level, competitive and orthogonal, it's really difficult for you to apply any of these sort of like parallel elements to it in order to keep people interested. And I think that's why something like Smash Bros keeps going, is because so much of the party game aspect with the items dropping and stuff contribute more to the sort of politicking or playing beside people as opposed to directly, I have to fight that one person, right? It allows you to hide on the sidelines a little more.
Yeah, I mean, and that brings up politics gameplay too as part of the parallel or a different mode of interactivity, right? That isn't necessarily so skill expressive with the game systems itself. Politics has its own skill set that's separate from the game systems, but whatever, I'm digressing. The fighting game I would bring up about in this category is Soul Calibur. Actually, with Soul Calibur's single player mode was very robust and had like a level up system and all kinds of stuff that was pretty interesting. Different weapons and things you can unlock for characters and stuff. But yeah, I think the other part of the market shift that's happened here is that there's a lot more people playing games, and it's possible that this audience has kind of either always been here but maybe wasn't as interested in games, and it's actually not a reduction in competitive games that we're seeing, but it's a explosion of parallel play games that happens to be more inviting to a much wider audience. And so companies that are focused on making the most money are probably not going to make a game that would be inherently as niche as what a hyper-competitive RTS or something might be.
Yeah, I think as data started to get more and more heavily used and evolved in the sort of gaming space, I think what a lot of people started recognizing is how many people are playing these games that seemingly are not flashy, seemingly are not the most popular games. Like I was still blown away when I found out that like one of the farming simulator games is like one of the top 10. Like, I think there's multiple farming simulators, multiple simulator games that are like the top games on PC gaming. And like when you consider those, they're like really insanely popular fringe games that people don't discuss. But I think a big contribution to that is the parallel play that's allowed with it. It's the fact that like you can hop on, you can play sort of by yourself, interact with that game in whatever way that you feel you want to interact with it, and then hop off. And I feel like that went unnoticed for many years in the industry up until the 2010s or so.
So you're saying Farmville on Facebook was to blame, is what you're saying?
I'm saying I think they started noticing these trends. And yes, I think something like Farmville and a lot of the mobile games and Facebook games and stuff were kind of keying in on this, that it's like people want to just hop in, they want to play a game, and then they don't tell anybody that they're playing this game. It's like it's their hobby they just do on the side, and that's that, right? It's not their life. It's not something they're competitively driven in.
Yeah, right. And that is something with games that exist further on the orthogonal spectrum, is they tend to be much more intense attention holding games that you have to give all of your attention to when you are playing them. And that brings us to sort of the next idea here, which is that there's cultural shifts that have happened. The biggest one, which can't be ignored, is social media, in that social media has captured a lot of people's attention. The time that they maybe would have spent previously playing games is now spent scrolling TikTok or watching YouTube. We're part of the problem.
Oh no. Go play Magic right now. They probably are while watching.
Yeah. Well, and part of there's a couple of things that I think are happening here. One, we could talk about attention spans, but we talked a little bit before this, and we're like, we feel like that might be a little bit overblown, right?
It's weird to assume that attention spans are getting shorter, as opposed to we're testing the boundaries of what a human's attention span is.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know what came first, right? Because like we've never had stuff like this demanding our attention at this rate.
And so, anecdotally, I've heard a lot of game developers say that they are now building games knowing that they're competing with social media. And so part of this parallel play might also be the same thing that Netflix is doing, which is basically saying we're making second screen content.
Yeah.
And so we need to make games that are inherently less intense and easy to move in and out of, very flexible systems that are just sort of low, casual, chill experiences because you can pop in and out of them whenever.
Right. And I think like this is a good segue into talking about like the same cultural shift of streamers and Twitch and stuff, because I think what's happened is people started designing games specifically for this. I think there's lots of games that are designed very specifically for Twitch, and those tend to not be, well, I was going to say like other ones, like little add-ons and stuff like that people like get aren't usually super popular or really robust. But then there's games like The Bazaar that had like a lot of funding, a lot of development that took it had streamers in mind, but was not designed necessarily as like, this is only a Twitch game or something. Developers are now considering this as part of marketing and part of this shared experience, right? Where you could go and watch someone like Kriparian every night or whatever, play The Bazaar, and like you can contribute to his decisions, right? You can watch him, and them as the content creator can go, I don't know, chat, should I pick this or that or whatever? And they have all the time in the world to go and like create that moment.
Right. And if you're playing something like competitive StarCraft, right, you're not able to take any time to
talk to the chat. Yeah. Like, what are you going to do?
You can't do anything besides push buttons and look at the screen, right?
Yeah. So, like only, and what's funny is like even League of Legends started contributing to this, right? It might have been like even potentially early signs. I don't know if it's developed in mind with this, but it could have been like early indicators of like developers noticing this interaction with streamers, right? Where there's more of that downtime where you're going and interacting with chat or you're talking to people or whatever, because it's not like action every single second.
Well, and what are people more likely to watch? You just executing the gameplay or you interacting with chat, right? Why are they there? Why are they there during a live stream when they could just watch a replay, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that we actually didn't write down, but the other thing I wanted to bring up here is that gamers have gotten older. And I do think that might have a cultural shift here that has happened, is that as gamers have gotten older, they have less time to play games, but there's still a huge audience of people that are at those different stages, right? Like, all right, well, if you're, this is sort of the rise of dad games or whatever, where you don't have the time to invest in a hyper competitive game anymore. you still want to play games, right? And so having this ability to have a more chill, relaxing experience when you get home from work and pop in, pop out when you feel like it, and there's not that intense, ladder competitive game thing going on. And there's probably other players again that are still interested in that, but when the massive audience of games has grown so large, it's possible that if you want to capture as many people as you can, you might want to make a game that's just more chill.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I feel like there's studies that have been done showing that like somewhere around the mid 30s to early 40s is when people generally shift from like less active games that require more actions in a lower amount of time to, they say less
actions, lower amount of time?
Sorry, games that require more actions in a shorter amount of time to games that require less actions in a longer span of time. Just because, it ends up still focusing on the things that you really enjoy about games, which is, everything we talk about that makes up a game of meaningful decisions and uncertain outcomes, measurable results, all that. But you can think about it, right? Like it's not like demanding your attention every single second.
There was this like video game trends research thing that came out. I'll try to link it in the description if I can find it again. Theoretically it's there. All right. But it was basically talking about how people are like spending their time and what video games are competing with, and social media was a big one. It was also saying that like young men are spending a lot more time with working, like doing crypto trading and sports gambling and all kind like the stuff that's like interactive, but like not gaming in the way that we would traditionally think of it.
Like a gamified version of something though, right?
Yes. Yeah. Very gamified. Yeah. Very gamified, but not necessarily a game, right? Interactive, but not necessarily a game. Social media is that way. Crypto's basically that way. Sports betting, market, what are they called? Prediction markets, those sort of things. Game designers have they basically have a profit incentive to move in this direction. And part of it is competition, but part of it is also sort of ease of play, ease of audience acquisition, right? Where designing a game that is more parallel, less orthogonal, less, I don't want to say less inherently challenging, because I don't think that's the case, but I do think that there is a much higher level of stress involved in playing an intense orthogonal experience, especially against other players, where there's a feeling of observation. There's a feeling of that it's going to take you a while to get good at this game and investing a lot of time in it. And with so many other distractions, I do wonder if that's the big motivator here, right? Is that there are so many more distractions now than what there were before.
Obviously, competitive games still get made. We just talked about earlier how like fighting games are still something that's like really commonly made. But it does feel like
2XKO did just fail. So, but is that fighting games or is that?
But Dragon Ball Xenoverse 3 is on the way. One point in time, it was almost all companies were trying to make some sort of a competitive game. That was the thing to do. You wanted to make a competitive game to compete with, the new Halo or something. Or
esports.
Esports, I think, pushed this agenda significantly. And when that failed to continue to make money, unless you were like one of the big ones, like OG StarCraft or League of Legends or something like that, I think people started looking towards these other audiences, these sort of untapped audiences that like existed.
Is it just that Riot took it all over? Like, did Riot just succeed? I guess Counter-Strike was still played competitively, but basically, like, I think in terms of the esports idea that we're going to like make games into a sport, Riot's basically the only company that succeeded at it, right?
I think that
there's other stuff, but
I don't think you can plan for things to be an esport.
Right.
And I think the problem is a lot of people that made a game planning for it to be an esport when you don't know what's going to be a cultural phenomenon.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
StarCraft wasn't planned to be an esport.
That's true.
They lucked into that.
That was like before that was even...
And that was like
it's basically like
one.
the first esport. Yeah.
And...
StarCraft 1.
StarCraft 1, yeah. So like, I think it's significantly harder for you to end up designing these specific experiences.
It's more challenging to design a balanced, well executed and interesting orthogonal play experience.
Well,
right?
And when your goal is you like, especially if you're looking at money, right, and success as you want it to have a lot of players and potentially have some sort of an esports scene, Like, because you can't guarantee that, what you can guarantee is how many casual players would be interested or how many people would like to socialize. Because what happens is people it's very difficult for people to separate the enjoyment they get from socializing in a game versus the game itself. So oftentimes people will sort of gravitate towards like, that's their game that them and their friend group play, even if that game is like technically maybe not that fun for them.
Right.
But
they
like
associate
together,
it with the social interaction.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a lot easier for you to end up creating an experience that facilitates that social interaction, knowing that like it doesn't need to be balanced. It doesn't need to try and garner this huge amount of attention and create an esport, right? Like you just need to be able to have enough things planned so that people will interact with their friends, in some one night of gaming.
You're just you're facilitating the friend experience, but good feelings are automatically associated with the game because you're playing them with your friends, right? The activity is not solely focused on the game systems. They're not being scrutinized and pushed to their most extreme so that you find the pieces of it that maybe don't work so well or whatever. Nobody's really doing that if they're just hanging out in a casual parallel play kind of environment. The other thing, so like parallel play design wise, like designers would choose this style of gameplay for design reasons, not just like sort of the marketing, I guess, aspects of these things, right? Like a parallel play game is inherently easier to make work for different numbers of players, right? You can, if a game is more parallel, it's easier to make it a solo game, right? Because if your opponents don't matter as much, it's easier for you to then replace those with systems or forego them entirely. And it just becomes like a high score kind of game, right? Where you, solo board games are having a big moment, right? They're like that. They are, expanding on the scene and doing quite well. And inherently those games are parallel play, right? They basically have to be, right? But you can also, accommodate, odd numbers of players. You're not concerned about competitive integrity where like games that are more orthogonal would need balanced level, like probably even numbers of players so that you have sort of balanced interaction between players. Famously, Commander does not work particularly well with 3 people or 5 people because I think of the interactive nature of Magic the Gathering. But if instead you're all sort of siloed into your own things and sort of just counting up to an end goal, it doesn't matter when the game ends. It can be like first, second, third place. Your interaction with those players does not prevent them from continuing to play the game. So flexibility in system design might be a design motivator for why you would want to use more parallel play.
The other issue with competitive games is that, especially with how they're advertised or how like their ecosystem works and stuff, how like they are involved in gaming culture, is that you sort of end up creating this higher barrier to entry. We've talked about this a lot when it comes to sort of like buckets of players that you play, right? We talk about this when it comes to like randomness and competitiveness in games, is that if you don't have enough variance in your game, or randomness, depending on how you want to phrase it, you end up creating instances where your most competitive players, your highest skilled players, are going to increase that distance between their games, their meaningful games, with players of a lower skill. So when you have randomness involved, let's say like items in Smash Bros, in a 1v1 Smash Bros game, the chances of a lower skilled player trying to get the upper hand on a higher skilled player is more likely because of the randomness of these items dropping. They can grab a bomb or the hammers being the best point here, and that one thing can turn the tide for them. But when there's minimal randomness or very low amounts of randomness, then suddenly that gap of skill becomes that much greater. And so what ends up happening in competitive games is oftentimes randomness is like seen as something not good. It's not something that the players really gravitate towards. A lot of them really care primarily about that skill. And this is something that plagues card games still, right? Lots of people still get upset at Magic because of land screw or mana flood or whatever, because they feel like that's too random and it creates a non-game. So card games even try to curb this still, even if it's inherently random from a systems level. But it's this higher barrier to entry when a game has been out for a long enough period of time and people have become so good at it that it's very difficult for new players to want to get in and feel like they can have any sort of an impact. But if instead it's more of that parallel play, oftentimes it can either be cooperative or it's non-interactive or low interaction, where you feel like you can still contribute or do something without being reminded that you are a much lower skilled player in the environment.
Another sort of design implication and why you might want more parallel play in your game is that if players are able to sort of play more solo, this is probably one of Magic's secret weapons, actually, is that Magic, when you're deck building, you can goldfish your deck to sort of practice. So you can play the game in a sort of a solo mode, right? And I think the ability to do that, I think, cannot be overstated, right? As something that is very important to keep players' attention on the game that you were creating, because you are giving players the ability to play the game when they're not actually like playing the game with other players. And that is something that parallel play offers, right? And Magic systems being kind of split down the middle in terms of orthogonal and parallel, I think this is one of its greatest strengths, right? It is that it is so flexible. Okay, so in terms of takeaways, what are we, because of the shift towards parallel play, what are we giving up? What are we potentially losing, or what is something that designers might think about in terms of, I could offer this to the market when the market has shifted in such an extreme kind of direction towards parallel play to differentiate yourself?
Yeah, I mean, we're still maintaining this level of like socializing and social aspects of gaming, but we're sort of just knocking out this very specific type, which is competition. Yeah. And there is a market for that. There's an audience of people that are interested in that. And I think what people maybe discredit is how many people are actually interested in competition, but don't have a better onboarding experience to get themselves to that point.
Yeah, Friday Night Magic was like perfect for like casual competitive play.
Yeah. You need to be able to have someone that has some sort of an entry point to dip their toes in competition, but allow them also to sort of ramp up and scale up and actually start competing in ways. And I feel like most games just sort of lop it off, or they sort of like have that as something you can do, but it's sort of like a side thing, where it's like, yeah, if you want to go and fight people online or like go and do that mode or whatever, like you can, but we're not going to give that much attention to it. And instead we're just going to focus on this parallel play, casual experience, knowing that's where we're going to be making most of our money.
The other thing that I think, and I guess advantage in this case to building something that has more orthogonal gameplay, is that you're taking full advantage of the fact that the game has another player in it, right? Parallel play can be siloed. It feels a little solo. Your game actions don't necessarily interact with your opponent's game actions. And so the game can feel a bit samey, right? That you're sort of just executing the lines of play. But the difficult thing, I think, in parallel play is trying to mimic that idea with a system, right? Like you can build randomness into a system, but it's basically impossible for you to create what's called donkey space. This is something that who came up with this name? I don't remember.
It wasn't Serlin. I don't know who came up with it.
At any rate, donkey space was coined by somebody else, but it's the idea that you might play suboptimally to make your opponent think that you don't know what you're supposed to be doing. But then your opponent might also think that you're playing suboptimally to make them think that they you know what I mean? That's the like one-upping metagame of chess, basically, is like, who's run out of prep? Are they pretending to have run out of prep, or do they actually run out of prep? That's like the core of what chess is and why it's so replayable. And that type of play is basically impossible to simulate with randomness or with a system. Elden Ring actually probably does a pretty good job of this, because the question becomes, with enough randomness, can you mimic the idea of someone who is actually thinking? And that's in a digital environment. Like Elden Ring can actually kind of simulate this, because it can track actions that the player is doing, and then and then the enemy's AI can respond to actions that you're doing. And some of these are really obvious. Like some bosses, when you go to drink a potion, they will always attack you, and so you can know, like, okay, I can recognize that pattern. But other times, some of the bosses will, based on your actions, whether you're playing more aggressively or more defensively, they'll adjust their behavior accordingly. But that can't really happen in a tabletop environment, right? Like you're not going to be able to build a dynamic system that can monitor players' inputs and outputs in any kind of convincing way, because that stuff all would have to happen behind the curtain.
You could. Digital. It would just be very complex, probably, to have that system play itself out.
Way too complex, and also you'd probably know it was happening, right? I think that's the big thing with Elden Ring, is that you don't necessarily know this is happening behind the scenes.
Sure, yeah, and I mean, yeah, I think it's what amount of variance like can get you as close as possible to a player. And yeah, like I don't think there's a realistic amount of variance, right? That any system could create. I think people are going to say AI can do that, but I don't think that's going to be possible.
AI is in like ChatGPT AI, right?
Yeah. But like, because even something like Elden Ring, right, that you point to, is like those boss fights are really difficult, and sometimes really complex, but the challenge is learning it. And once you learn it and it's memorized, it's still an encounter that you can go through, and you know the dance, that you need to perform in.
And the only way that you're going to get someone to recognize that you have understood the pattern that they're doing is with another player, right? There's no real way to emulate that. Simulate that, I think, at a systems level.
If you enjoy listening to us talk about parallel play and orthogonal play and stuff like that, please feel free to give us a like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below.
If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.